Welcome to Reading the Room, a literary podcast featuring author interviews and discussions with bookish content creators. I am your host, Jalen, also known as The Bar in the Bookcase on YouTube. Today I am joined by Kathryn Scanlan, author of Kick the Latch, out now from New Directions and Daunt Books. I discovered Kathryn Scanlan's work from my interview with Amina Kane last year, in which she recommended this book to me, and I am so glad that Amina did because this has become a recent favorite of mine. Kick the Latch follows the arc of one woman's life at the racetrack. Based on interviews with this woman, Sonia, a horse trainer, the novel investigates form and authenticity. As Kathryn Scanlan puts it, I wanted to preserve, amplify, exaggerate Sonia's idiosyncratic speech, her bluntness, her flair as a storyteller. I arrived at what you could call a composite portrait of a self. There's a blurb on the back of this book from Lydia Davis, and I think she perfectly, in 2 words, describes what this book is doing, and that is empathic ventriloquy. Kathryn Scanlan embodies Sonia's voice through these interviews and gives us a very brief story that contains so much through its concision. Kathryn Scanlan is also the author of Ogden Fog and The Dominant Animal, a story collection. And I asked many questions about Ogden Fog in this interview, and so to give you a brief description of that book as well, 15 years ago, Kathryn Scanlan found a stranger's diary at an estate auction in a small town in Illinois. The owner of the diary was 86 years old when she began recording the details of her life in the book. After reading and rereading the diary, studying and dissecting it, Scanlan played with the sentences that caught her attention, cutting, editing, arranging, and rearranging them into the composition that became Ogden Fog. Also, if you are a fan of Reading the Room and would like to support the podcast, I have a Patreon. It is patreon.com/readingtheroom, and there are currently 2 support tiers to help me keep this podcast going in perpetuity. Thank you very much for all who have supported so far and for listening and sharing these episodes. It really means the world to me, so I cannot thank you all enough. Now let's get into the chat with Kathryn Scanlan. Kathryn, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to start by asking you about Ogden Fog and Kick the Latch. I feel like these books are very much in conversation with each other. In both of these books, you're writing from a real life. One being a person that you've met and conversed with, and one being from a diary that you received. And so I'm wondering what different challenges or opportunities were presented in each book for you, and whether Ogden Fog informed Kick the Latch in certain ways.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when I was first thinking about how to write Kick the Latch, I was definitely thinking about it being in conversation with Ogden Fog, or like being sort of a continuation of that project or that interest of sort of working with found material and found speech. But yeah, very different, obviously, because the one was a written document from several decades ago, and the other was were transcripts of conversations that I had. And then also, since Sonia is someone who is alive, I could have additional conversations with her about the book and sort of show her the book and get her approval on it.
Ogden Fog, in the introduction, there's something I came across that was interesting in my reflection on Kick the Latch after. There's a quote here where you say, "I have possessed this work so thoroughly that the diarist has ceased to be an entirely unique, autonomous other to me. I don't picture her. I am her." And it made me think about Kick the Latch and the difference there between you actually meeting Sonia and recording those conversations and being able to ask her if something is faithful to her experience. And you didn't really have that experience with Ogden Fog. So I'm wondering if that idea of the voice of Kick the Latch being a part of you as well, like, is that true for you?
I think so. I think it's similar, maybe even more so, because, Ogden is really mostly built from that found speech, whereas Kick the Latch is more of a blend, I would say, of, sort of original speech of Sonia's from the transcripts and my writing, sort of my voice. So I think of it as sort of like a combination of our voices in a way, even though I was trying to, create something that felt very faithful to her voice.
And do you think, in terms of your short story writing, it made me think about how in Kick the Latch there's the titled vignettes, and it reminded me of your stories in a similar way. I have a question for you later about titles, but I'm wondering, in terms of your writing of Kick the Latch, how much you give or let your imagination kind of go with the primary source versus in short story writing where it's purely or primarily coming from your mind, I would assume. Does your brain feel like it's operating on a different register when you're writing short stories versus either of these books?
I mean, probably. But I will say that a lot of my stories are sort of made in a similar way to Kick the Latch, where they're based on this sort of found material that I have in my notebooks that I work from, which is, stories I've heard from other people and language I've picked up on just, hearing, eavesdropping. But, definitely the stories I'm usually taking, more liberties with that material, and sort of inventing more than I did in Kick the Latch. But at the same time, I would say that these, the vignettes or chapters in Kick the Latch were a way for me to sort of play with that material a little bit, even if only just in the shaping, in the framing of things.
It makes me think about your work in relation. We were speaking about Mina Kane before we started recording, but a question I had here was about this line that I think you both walk with realism and ambiguity, and it's really interesting and it's kind of mind blowing to me. I don't know what my question is about it really, but I'm wondering how I guess you think about it as a writer in terms of being very precise and concise in your sentences and trying to, for example, Kick the Latch, evoke Sonia's voice on the page, but also say like in your stories, there's a lot of ambiguity and mystery in that despite its exactness. And I'm wondering if that's something that's like at top of mind while you're writing, or it kind of just becomes the final product given all those forces.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know how conscious I am of any of those things while I'm working, but I do know that I just have a really strong interest in reality as far as like working from reality, whatever that means, my reality. Starting with that as sort of like a solid place to begin with, and then being able to use that solidness to kind of stray into these other sort of more unknown areas.
Something I've been thinking a lot about recently is this idea of like, passive narration or certain novels where the narrator doesn't really take the primary seat, or when they hear stories from other people being told to them and then it's relayed to the reader. For example, top of mind is like Outline by Rachel Cusk. I'm wondering, in your books, you're looking very directly in these two books, Ogden and Kick the Latch. You're looking at other people very directly, and kind of synthesizing that information being told to you. Do you have any writerly inclinations to write about yourself in a direct way in future work, or do you prefer having other stories and other people as sort of mediums for exploring your own identity through them?
Yeah, both, I would say. I mean, I feel like I do, draw more from myself as a, kind of a character construct sometimes, in some of my stories, a little bit in the novel that I'm working on now. But I think that it feels really rich to me to talk about other people and to be able to use this other kind of material. It's funny you said that about Cusk, about her outline books, because I was thinking about those when I was starting to think about and write Kick the Latch. Like I think that after, my first conversation with Sonia, I had a picture of what the book would be and how I would write it, and that was pretty much like what the book is now. But that was kind of my first thought, and then I felt like I needed to think about it a little more, and that the Cusk approach was kind of like one of the approaches that I was thinking about, kind of like this, because I just love what she does in those novels, and thinking like, oh well, maybe there should be a narrator, who's sort of me, who's just sort of listening to this person, and sort of, make Sonia like a third person character who's telling this long kind of monologue story to me. But then it just that, first of all, Cusk already did it, and then second of all, that just didn't feel like what the book needed to be. I just wanted this very direct narration, and to try to like maybe recreate for the reader like the feeling that I had listening to this person telling me her story. Yeah.
I think I want to ask you next about Sonia as a character, thinking about just the structure and how you put this thing together, meaning in vignettes and then also the parts of this book. How did that come together for you in terms of cutting and reorganizing her life? Like, when did you know where to start and end, and just the general structure of the book?
So I wrote a first draft of the book that was just based on the first conversation that I had with her, which was about 3 or 4 hours long. And I really liked the idea of that, being able to like write a whole book just from like one afternoon of conversation. But then when I finish the draft, it wasn't right. And so then I ended up having a lot more conversations with her. So, but that first draft, I started just by, I transcribed the conversation first of all. And then from that sort of large document, I just started cutting and pasting sections, or what felt like kind of self-contained anecdotes, or, trying to break it down into stories, because partly because the reason she delivered her narration to me in that way, sort of, she's kind of like telling a lot of little stories and things. But it was also just a way for me to kind of like get a hold of it, try to grapple with it. And I'm comfortable with stories, and I like having sort of smaller units to work on. So I, cut these sections from the transcript into individual documents, and then started working with those and editing those and shaping those and changing those. But then, later on, like I said, then I kind of had to go back and sort of start that process over again with the new conversations and the new transcripts, and then adding those in. So the overall structure, as far as the 12 sections and the titles and the order of things, and all of that got changed quite a bit, like later in the process.
In terms of the titles, I mean, I was thinking going through your short stories and then reflecting back on Kick the Latch, do you often start a vignette or a story from a title, or do you title it after you write them?
I would say both. And the titles of these, in Kick the Latch, those were really a way for me to have fun. I mean, I guess
Yeah.
that's, titles I think function that way a lot for me.
Do you find that titles are difficult at all? I'm reflecting on my conversation with Amina, and she was talking about how it can be hard to figure out like what the right title is for something, or how to, contain an entire book in one word or phrase, for example. Does it resonate with you?
Yes, I think it can be extremely difficult at times, but then other times there's just a title that comes really easily, I feel like, or, just is ready made. And sometimes I do write things with a title already in mind, but yeah, it can be very difficult.
The concision and compression of your sentences, and how you think about the sentence as a form or as a vehicle for, moving narrative, and how when something is too fluffed, for example, or when it needs to be shorter versus like, is it just a feeling that you have when you're writing and then later reading, or do you have like any sort of science to it?
Science. Um, no, I feel like it's always I work, sentence by sentence. And I don't really tend to move on until I like the sentence that I've written, because I feel like that is sort of the only way that I know how to work. I'm not able to like go ahead without liking what I've done already, like it demoralizes me. So it's kind of like laying one brick after another, and each one, builds on the one that came before, or like is somehow related to the one that came before, or like deliberately, swerves away from and departs from the one that came before.
That's interesting. Yeah, I've been thinking about in all your work how well it works, and it just seems so at once like effortless, but it also seems like it'd be very difficult to distill, a woman's life in such a few pages and very simple sentences. Like, it's kind of magical in how you're able to do that. And that's also taken from like the blurbs in the back. I feel like they all do a really good way of explaining or putting adjectives to that experience of reading this book. And one thing that I was talking to my friends about this morning, and I don't know how I want to ask this, but I'm thinking about the brevity of your work, and also considering like social media now and attention spans, and thinking about the idea of how concise your work is as a form of art, or as being like an aesthetic principle to aspire to, I guess, versus something that's like easy to consume, or whether like shorter books are going to be prioritized over longer books. And I guess I'm just wondering how you think about the length of your work from like aesthetically, if that makes sense.
Hmm. Well, I mean, I don't think that shorter work necessarily means easier to consume work. I actually think it's kind of the opposite sometimes, where work has been sort of like so compressed that you can't, it like resists you moving through it quickly, it won't let you. I mean, I really like that kind of work. I'm interested in that kind of work. I mean, I don't know. It's a funny thing because I feel like I feel like I kind of, have a short attention span or an impatience with things sometimes, but I feel like my impatience usually comes from things that are longer than it seems like they needed to be. And it feels like the person who made it isn't really thinking about the chunk of my life that I'm giving to it. But yeah, I don't know. I sort of gravitate towards shorter work, and I get sort of impatient with things, I think, owing to my deteriorating attention span, but I don't necessarily think that needs to be like a thing to be. It's not necessarily a bad thing, or a thing to be like ashamed of or something.
Yeah, absolutely. That happened to me with, in particular, your short stories, where I felt like I needed to keep rereading them to keep trying to like mine them for more to see what I might have missed on a first read. And I think it's interesting in terms of how brief they are, but how much they can contain given that concision. It's a really interesting paradox. Going to Kick the Latch and the narrative, how did you think about plot and momentum of the story?
Well, I think that there was this kind of, natural narrative arc of Sonya's life that was, inherent in the conversations that we had, even though, it's not like it came to me in like this perfect chronological arc, anything like that. But so I think that part of it was sort of, felt sort of easy or like natural to make this, you know, to structure this story in that way, just sort of like very simply, Um, I suppose there could have been a case made for, mixing it up or chopping it up, and having it move forward and backward in time, but this to me felt like the most straightforward and, the best way to do it.
I love how it ends on this hopeful note. And I'm wondering how you know where to end a work. And then also going back to the introduction of Ogden Fog, how you talk about how you still find yourself moved by the diary. And I guess my question is, despite these works ending, do you still feel like they're forces on your future work or how you still think about writing, or do you ever want to return to either character?
Hmm. I don't know that I would return to either character. They both feel pretty self-contained as works to me, but I know that they're going to continue to be in my mind and to inform future work. I don't know, I probably shouldn't even say this because I'm kind of superstitious. I don't like talking about work that I'm working on. But, there's a character in Kick the Latch that Sonya tells about that early in the book, Bicycle Jenny, this woman that lived in the town where Sonya grew up and was this kind of infamous local character and eccentric. That was that kind of, when she told me about that, that was during our first conversation. And I think that was kind of the moment where I was like, I think I can write a book about this person and like these stories that she's telling me. But then, like shortly after the book came out this fall, Sonya was texting me and she sent me some newspaper articles that she had told me about in the past, but hadn't sent to me about this woman, this bicycle Jenny. And it was so I don't know, it really like shook me up to see these newspaper articles. They're so interesting. It was about when her house burned down. And so I started, like the last couple months, I've been sort of working with the local public library and just trying to see if I could dig up any more articles about this person. And I did find some. And so that's something that's kind of in the back of my mind as far as like potentially I could write more about this other individual. But, it also feels like such a funny thing, like my sequel, but we'll see where that goes. But yeah, very interesting individual.
I would love to read that. So I hope that comes to something. How does your reading life factor into your writing life? Does it feel quite distinct to you or do they kind of overlap? I'm just curious to know like what you like to read generally.
Yeah, I think they overlap. I think that what I'm reading is always informing what I'm thinking about and what I'm working on in any given day. It really it's there in the mind, so it's going to come through. I mean, I feel like I have kind of a little bit of a tortured relationship with reading sometimes, because I don't know, I get frustrated where I feel like it's hard for me to read as much as I would like to be reading while I'm working kind of intensively. Like, it just feels like there's a little bit less space for that. But, I have this sort of desire to read, so many things that I haven't read. So yeah.
Yeah, I feel that frustration. I'm not a writer myself, but there's so many books and so many authors that I want to speak to, but it's like physically impossible. That is
Yeah.
really frustrating for me
Yeah.
in this new venture as well. But yeah, I mean, I was curious to know, like, do you have any books coming out this year or anything like on your radar that you're looking forward to, or anything you read so far this year that you really liked?
Yeah. Well, right now I'm reading The Long Form by Kate Briggs. She wrote that book, This Little Art, which is about translation. And then The Long Form is her first novel. Um, Maybe like a third or halfway through it right now. And it's a really interesting book. She's a really interesting thinker. Formally, yeah. I don't know if I can say anything very articulate about it, but I'm enjoying it. And then, Michael Earl Craig has a book of poetry coming out this spring with Wave, a new collection of poetry from him, which I'm always excited to see that. And Diane Williams has a new collection of short stories being published, I think like August. She's one of my favorite living writers, so I'll be very excited when that comes out. There's a book called The Nature Book by Tom Kamita that's also coming out this spring. That is, I read it last year to give a quote for it, but it's a really interesting book. It's a novel that's completely constructed from descriptions of nature from other novels.
That sounds cool. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for those. Yeah, I always find like my best, recommendations when asking authors. Like I came to your work from Amina Kane recommending Kick the Latch in our episode. And so and so I'm always like look forward to whatever authors recommend. One more thing I wanted to ask you about Og9 Fog. I know we're here primarily to talk about Kick the Latch, but I just read it like I think it was yesterday, the day before, and it is kind of. I know I just read it, so of course it's still atop of my mind, but I can see it also haunting me going forward. Those last 3 pages were so moving, and I'd never read a book that was so sparse, yet felt like I met someone and that I kind of knew who they were despite there being no real descriptors of who they are. Like it's such an interesting book, especially to think about Kick the Latch and how similar yet different they are. And how do those two books, where do you go from here in terms of your writing and how you think about doing, I guess, new things from those two books? Because I know you mentioned earlier about, Rachel Cusk and Outline and trying to do something different. And I guess my question might be going to like originality and trying to find those new sources of inspiration. It's a big one. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, I think I just, like the thing that I'm kind of engrossed in right now is this novel that, in some ways I'm trying to write it because it feels like a challenge to myself. Like I haven't written a book like this, but it's just like I mean, it's a little bit maybe more of a normal sort of approach, like just a, third person omniscient narration novel about some people, but I'm really liking the challenge of it so far. I'm always working on stories. I think that, I don't know, this question of originality, I don't know that I'm going to be able to say something like very coherent about it, but I do think that it feels a little more narrowly conceived than I think of originality. Or like, I think that originality is sort of prized in writing in this way where it's like, oh, the next new original voice, or the next person who's doing something completely new and it's all their doing, it's their singular genius or something like that. But I think that actually what feels original to me is sort of like unoriginality, or like listening to other people and sort of like recognizing how influenced you've been by so many other writers and people and artists in your life, and sort of realizing that making creative work is much more of like a collective activity, I think, than maybe we might think.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've been thinking about that in terms of, discussions around like autofiction generally and people talking about, how that's not really a new new form of writing or I guess way of thinking about that.
Mhm.
And I guess my last question for you here is about publication generally and doing press for your book and seeing readers' responses to your work. Has that impacted your writing life since, having books out, or how does that feel for you, like having people be able to consume Sonya's story now?
I think publishing work is much more intense than I anticipated, before I had published a book. I don't know, I feel sort of like both ways about it as far as like it's psychologically challenging at the same time that, how lucky are we that we can sort of as a writer, I can like see that people are actually reading my book and, having things to say about it, posting pictures of it, like all these things. Like it's pretty wonderful at the same time that it's intense. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been thinking about, being a podcaster now and trying to think about like what my role is in that, in terms of talking about books publicly. I take it seriously and sometimes I overthink things about books, and I don't know if it's to my detriment or to
Not
my benefit.
possible.
Thank you. I think I need that reassurance because sometimes I'm like, what am I like? I get so in the weeds of trying to think of questions, and then like for this one, I was like, I'm gonna have some talking points, but try to just move through it as I would in like a conversation. But then I feel like I stumbled a little bit at some places. But it's been really fun to like think through fiction, like forcing myself to think about it in a different way in preparation for these discussions. And it's always like asking authors about talking about their work publicly because it must be maybe a similar but also very different experience of having actually written the book that you're being asked questions about. It seems like it would be cool, yet maybe a little uncomfortable. I don't know. It's an interesting thing to think about as someone who doesn't write myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think just in both cases, in your case and in a writer's case, that it's just it's like it's a whole other arena of vulnerability, that involves your physical person. Yeah, it's a lot.
Totally. Well, thank you for coming on here and talking about it. I've been so excited about this. I've been raving about Kick the Latch since I read it. It's so so good. So thank you for taking the time, and I hope everyone watching will go pick it up if they haven't read it already. So thank you, Kathryn. I hope to get to talk to you in the future too for your next books because I'm very intrigued to see where those are going. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's great to talk to you.